This is Ian Cameron, teaming up with the sportsgeek.com, and we're going to break down CFL DraftKings for the upcoming Week 7 slate in the Canadian Football League. Let's get right down to business. Let's start by looking at the quarterback spot for Week 7. And to me, a couple of interesting options standing out. No surprise, Mike Riley, top quarterback in salary, 11.3K, but he is facing a Ottawa defense that a little bit banged up potentially this week in the secondary. Abdul Kanay, one of their top cornerbacks, may not play Saturday against the Edmonton Eskimos, so could be a chance for Mike Riley to have a good day. I certainly wouldn't talk anyone out of playing him, even though he's a very highly priced quarterback at 11,300 this week at DraftKings. Henry Burris, of course, has to be a consideration even at 10K. I know he didn't have a great game last week, but now he gets that Edmonton defense, an Edmonton defense that I've been looking to go against from a DraftKings perspective week in and week out, looking to find quarterbacks, receivers specifically, to just absolutely feast on a very weak Edmonton secondary. Maybe Burris able to bounce back this week and should be a little bit more comfortable shaking the rust off after being out for so long in that game against Toronto. Maybe he's a little bit more comfortable, plays better here this week. I think the best options at quarterback this week are down the board a little bit. Darian Durant is likely to return for the Saskatchewan Roughriders at 9,200. Calgary still dealing with a couple injuries on defense this week and some shuffling in their secondary, and a team that gave up 41 points to the BC Lions last week. I think Darian Durant might be a little bit of a value option at quarterback, 9,200. Jonathan Jennings as well, worth a look, 8,900. What a game for him last week. 3 touchdowns, unfortunately 2 costly interceptions, but he had an amazing game. 374 passing yards, 37.4 DK points last week against a pretty good Calgary defense. So Jonathan Jennings, I think that offense is going to have to carry BC this week. BC's defense littered with injuries. So Jonathan Jennings and that offense going to have to pull the rope a little bit this week for the Lions. So I think he's worth a look. And, even Kevin Glenn, 7,500 against a very injury-riddled BC defense. They suffered just a ton of injuries on defense against Calgary. A lot of those guys aren't playing on Thursday night. Kevin Glenn had a much better game, 20.7 DK points last week, almost 300 yards, 2 touchdown passes. He's worth a look. Riley and Burris, one of those two if you're going to go for a high-priced quarterback. But if you're looking for value at quarterback this week, Durant, Jennings, and Glenn are the 3 guys that stand out in that regard. I think you can mix and match. Durant, I'd put him in a lineup. Jennings, I'd put him in a lineup. Probably even Glenn as well, just because he's facing an injury-riddled BC defense this week. Running backs this week in the CFL, when you look at it, Andrew Harris starting to get his game going. So he at $7,400, maybe not a bad option this week. Problem is Hamilton's been pretty good against the run. I certainly wouldn't argue with, Jerome Messam. Definitely a decent option. Saskatchewan's really struggled on defense at times. Jerome Messam, a pretty decent option for Calgary, 14.9 DK points for him last week. I'm going to go down a little bit, though, in the value pool this week from a running back perspective, because from what I've read, it looks like the BC Lions, they might be having Jeremiah Johnson back on the field this week, and Jeremiah Johnson's been injured for a few weeks. From what I've been reading, he is likely to play, even though on DraftKings, Jeremiah Johnson, the BC running back, still listed as questionable. If he comes back, I think that's a boost to the BC ground attack. Anthony Allen has had some good moments, some not so good moments. He's been very inconsistent in terms of production. Jeremiah Johnson, a little bit more front top end speed than Anthony Allen. And he's got value. I think he's the best value running back, especially if he plays. And as far as I know, you want to make sure of this before Thursday night, but as far as I know, he is going to play in that game Thursday night against Montreal. So I think at 6,100, Jeremiah Johnson at running back, definitely worth a look this week. All right, wide receivers now. Guys that stand out to me, Naaman Roosevelt to me continues to be someone that the Saskatchewan Roughriders look to, even in a game where Saskatchewan did nothing last week. Mitchell Gale was awful. The offensive line couldn't do anything in terms of pass protecting or run blocking. Still, Naaman Roosevelt ended up with 7 catches, 67 yards, 13.7 DK points in a game that his team and his offense scored 3 points, a whopping 3 points, and he still put up some decent DraftKings production last week, Naaman Roosevelt. I would put him in my lineup. 9,000. That price just keeps on creeping up with Roosevelt week by week, but I still think he's worthy of an inclusion. Lots of injuries in the Winnipeg secondary this week. That's a concern. Luke Tasker at 8,500 definitely is a guy that stands out, maybe worth a look. A couple of Ticats. Luke Tasker, Chad Owens in particular. Tasker 8,500. Chad Owens all the way down at 7,400. I mean, those are guys that really could do some damage against, a Winnipeg secondary. Macho Harris is out. There's another guy in that secondary also out. There's been a lot of shuffling in that defensive backfield for Winnipeg, so something that the Hamilton Ticats might be able to exploit from a wide receiver perspective. I think Brian Burnham is really a guy that I would look to this week. Brian Burnham at $5,700. Look at the game he had last week. Brian Burnham for the Lions. 9 receptions, 139 receiving yards, 1 touchdown, 31.9 DK points. Jonathan Jennings is really putting a lot of trust and in Brian Burnham and really targeting him early and often, especially last week against Calgary. I think that might continue here. And look at the price you can get. $5,700 for a guy that racked up over 30 DK points last week. That is value personified, in my opinion. I think Brian Burnham, $5,700, absolutely will be in my lineups this week at wide receiver. DST to wrap up this video. Stampeders at $5,200 topping the list. I think the Ticats, the second highest salary defense this week in the CFL at $5,100 worth a look. I mean, Winnipeg's offense, who is Matt Nichols? He had a great game last week. That's what scares me. But who's he going to throw the football to this week? Weston Dressler out. Darvin Adams out. Ryan Smith out. Just a glut of injuries at receiver this week for this Winnipeg offense. I think Hamilton's defense, which has really played pretty solid most of the season, could be able to take advantage of a cluster injury situation for Winnipeg at receiver. There's a lot of new faces. They had to bring back Clarence Denmark, Winnipeg. Had to call him up, and out of the blue to bring him back to this team just because they're so decimated by injuries at receiver. So I think Hamilton's defense, a decent DST option at $5,100. And let's not forget, there's always Brandon Banks who can add to that DST output with his ability to return punts and return kicks. So very, very good option, I think, this week. The Ticats at $5,100. The Lions, I certainly wouldn't touch them this week at $4,800. I mentioned they've got cluster injuries on defense. I really don't like Ottawa's defense against Edmonton's offense, and I certainly don't like the Edmonton defense. So it's really slim pickings this week from a defensive perspective. Darian Durant likely to be back at quarterback for Saskatchewan this week. So I think St. Peter's defense did give up 41 points last week. Now faces Saskatchewan with their number 1 quarterback returning. Could be in some trouble. And I don't think there's any value with the Stampeders at $5,200. It's really slim pickings, and even Montreal's defense facing BC's offense, which has really looked good last week. Jonathan Jennings growing in confidence by the week. I think Hamilton is the clear choice for me from a DST perspective this week. Not really a lot else out there that really stands out in terms of good DST options this week. So my clear number 1 choice, definitely Hamilton Ticats, $5,100 in terms of DST for Week 7 here in the CFL. All right, that's going to wrap it up. That's my look at CFL DraftKings for the Week 7 slate. I'm Ian Cameron with thesportsgeek.com. As always, good luck with your CFL DraftKings lineups, and I'll be back next week to talk about Week 8 in the Canadian Football League.